And it is 1 p.m. now, so I think we will just shift gears onto our next session of the day. And that is the pandemic's impact on journalism. I'm very excited about this. We're going to have a panel of experts joining us because COVID-19 really did shift the way that not only we consume media, but how we deliver media. And that's both locally and nationally. News is going out in different ways all the time now, and we really saw that be the effect of the pandemic more than ever. So we're joined today by a panel of North Dakota news leaders to discuss this new era that we've entered into. What I'll do is introduce each of them and then give you about 5 minutes to describe your view on the pandemic's effect on journalism. I'm sure you have a lot of insights that none of us would have even thought of. So what I'll do is I'll introduce each of you first, and then we'll go around and we'll talk about those impacts that you've seen so far. Also, if anyone has questions throughout this panel, please go ahead and submit them through the chat function, and we'll get those to our panelists. So today we are joined by Amy Dalrymple, who was named the first female editor of the Bismarck Tribune in 2019. She joined the Tribune as a reporter in 2017 after working for Forum News Service covering the Bakken oil boom. She serves as vice president of the North Dakota Newspaper Association Board of Directors. We're also joined by Mary Jo Hotzler. She's the chief content officer for Forum Communications. She's been with the company in various writing, editing, and leadership roles for the past 19 years. She's also the editor of On the Minds of Moms magazine. And finally, we're joined by Sydney Mook, who's recently named the managing editor of the Grand Forks Herald. Congratulations, Sydney. She's originally from Northwest Iowa and moved to North Dakota after graduating from the University of South Dakota. She's worked as a reporter and a multimedia editor at the Dickinson Press. Thank you three for joining us today. I'm going to dive right in and pose that question that I said at the beginning, and we'll start with Amy. Amy, what is your view of the pandemic's impact on journalism? What have you experienced?
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for inviting me here today. I feel not sure that I'm an expert, but I feel kind of humbled by the term expert. But I think for here at the Tribune, the most exciting thing that we've seen as a result of the pandemic has been really an increase in awareness of the importance of local news. We've been reporting on the case numbers and the testing availability and vaccine availability and all the different state regulations and local regulations. And I think that readers really recognize that local news is really their only source for a lot of that important information. And I think people have at least expressed to us appreciation for our coverage of the pandemic. And we've also seen it in an increase in views on our website and subscriptions. We've seen, I think, a more awareness of the importance of local media. And so that's been really exciting. We also, during the pandemic, when the governor was holding the press conferences almost every day, we would have readers message us questions to ask the governor. I think they really recognized that we're the ones that could help get their questions answered for them. Another thing that the pandemic really brought, at least as a benefit to us, is that it really increased the versatility of the newsroom. We are a lot better at filing stories remotely because we had to get better at that. We did have some, at times, people working remotely. For the most part, we are all in the newsroom again, but we have been able to increase the social distancing and take some safety measures to keep us all safe. The pandemic also required us to be really creative sometimes, like if we needed to take pictures of people that were perhaps vulnerable, we had to take pictures of them outside. And so sometimes it caused us to be creative, but that was a good challenge to have. It's also changed the way that we access meetings, which has been both good and bad. We've been covering a lot of meetings remotely, which does help us cover more ground sometimes, but then it is also more challenging to ask the follow-up questions to the public officials if we're not there in the room with them. So I think there's been a lot of pros and cons with the pandemic and just the pace of news and the pace of keeping up with everything has been challenging, but I think our reporters and reporters statewide have really risen to that challenge.
Well, thanks so much, Amy. It sounds like a lot of innovation from your newsroom really sparked during this. So I want to pose kind of the same question to Mary Jo. What impacts have you seen in journalism throughout this pandemic?
Well, a lot of the same things that Amy said. I think Amy's spot on with a few of those. I mean, there's been good and there's been bad. And when we think about the pandemic, I really think about the whole last year, and it's the pandemic plus everything else, right? It all starts to sort of blend together, and it's all had a pretty significant impact. Our newsroom is, most of our newsrooms are empty right now. Now, the journalists are out doing the work. We have not all come back into the office necessarily. Here and there, yes, but as a whole, no. And yeah, like Amy said, that's great. And everybody in every industry has experienced this, I think, where it's like, well, that's great that we can do this. I think one of the hard parts about that for journalism is that, we have journalists who have been out there covering these stories, pandemic, politics, you name it, and it's tough, it's isolating, it's stressful. You cannot look away when you're in journalism, like maybe you can in other professions where you can just, take a break from the news. We can't do that. And yet, we don't have this sort of office camaraderie like we used to have maybe anymore, that sort of support network. And I think that's something we're going to have to get back to at some point. I think just journalism uniquely has a need for that and has always been built on that. And then the other thing I would say is just the types of stories that we cover outside of the pandemic and the politics has changed this last year, just as audience interests have changed, people's interests have changed, news consumption patterns have changed. We see areas like health coverage being, an area that, suddenly does really well for us, and that people are consuming tons of content, not just about the pandemic, but about the wellness side of health and, how to stay healthy, be healthy. We've seen a resurgence in home and garden content. Our gardening content, people apparently can't get enough of it, but I think it's that escape content that has sort of paired with the peril content, the pandemic stuff, the really heavy stuff. And people have been navigating to some of that. Small business is another area that I would say that, people are seem to be consuming that content more. So we've shifted as a result of people's interest and habit shifting. And I presume, we'll just have to keep evolving with that, because I don't think the impacts of this year and the pandemic have even fully been realized yet. I think we're just now starting to recognize some of that. So yeah, like Amy said, good and bad, but absolutely an impact.
Yeah, it sounds like evolution in every newsroom has been incredibly necessary during this. So I'm going to pass it over to Sydney now and ask you the same question. What impacts have you seen at the Herald on journalism?
Yeah, so Amy and Mary Jo really covered it quite well with everything. We're seeing similar things at the Herald. It's tough as reporters and editors to not be in the same building, to be able to bounce ideas off of one another and figure things out in different ways that we normally would. And it's great to have things like Zoom. We have Zoom meetings every morning at the Herald where we just go around and we talk about what we're working on, but it's not quite the same as being in a room and being able just to jot things down and fire things back and forth. So we've learned how to adjust to that. Lots of phone calls, texts, lots of Zooms. And then we've just kind of figured out, different ways to reach different audiences in our region also. For example, we went up to the northern border back in the fall and went up there and just did stories about what was going on at the northern border and people not being able to, go over to Canada, and what does that mean for businesses in Northwest Minnesota. And it was a really cool project that we put together. But the fact that we were able to put it together remotely when it had a lot of story elements and it also had a very large video component, it ended up being like a 40-minute documentary. We had to learn how to do kind of a 40-minute documentary like from home, which was a challenge of how do you get, all the footage to the right person, and then, hey, where's this photo and everything like that. So I think it really been focusing on communication a lot, and how do we interact and how do we make sure that we all know what's going on, because it's tough sometimes and people can get burnt out from Zooms and everything like that, but we still got to be able to stay on top of everything in the meantime.
Absolutely. And I will say that Northern Border coverage was fantastic. The team did a great job with that.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah. And Mary Jo hit on something that I think was really interesting too, about changes in news consumption, the kind of stories that folks are looking for. And Sydney, I'm going to throw it right back in your area. Where have you seen news consumption change a little bit? Whether it's different content or even how people are getting their news.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are still kind of getting their news through their classic social media feeds and everything like that. And I definitely know that we saw, I think Amy had mentioned, people reaching out to ask the governor questions during that. We definitely saw that here as well with, learning how to embed like live streams and stuff into our website so people could watch, the mayor giving a talk about the coronavirus. So a lot of that kind of has stayed the same. I would say that we had kind of a bump from like the Facebook and whatnot for a while. But yeah, one thing that I thought was interesting was this summer we saw an uptick in people interested in like home improvement stuff. So it was like last spring, people were interested in, they're all, locked in their homes essentially. So people are very interested in buying like new fridges and paint and siding and everything like that. And so I think we definitely saw a bump in that kind of content, which was kind of fun. And it's also it was fun content to write because it was slightly different than, the typical coronavirus, numbers and stuff. So I think that made it fun kind of for some of the reporters when we were doing a little bit of work in that area.
And Amy, I'm sure you were seeing some of the same things at the Tribune as well. And as an editor, did that change the way that you did your job or the way you decided what kind of content that reporters would be chasing after? Or how did the pandemic kind of change how your newsroom worked?
Yeah, well, it really every story became a COVID story, and that was kind of challenging because it affected sports, it affected just every aspect of our lives, and so that was, a big impact on all the stories we were covering. But we did also try to be cognizant of COVID fatigue and tried to find other stories that were maybe non-COVID to give our readers a break, but also to give our reporters a break, because sometimes they just wanted to do more of a fun story. We did have more reporters do some personal columns at times during the pandemic, maybe about how I think Amy Sisk did a column on gardening because she really got into gardening a lot last year with the pandemic, and a lot of readers did too, as Mary Jo mentioned. And so I think sometimes writing more from the personal column on the impact that they were experiencing, that kind of found its way into our news stories and columns.
And it's interesting that you bring up the fatigue, because someone actually just answered a question about, or just asked a question about that in terms of fatigue, not only for the reporters, but also for the readers. The reporters for covering these stories and the readers for reading it after it, day after day. Mary Jo, I'll pose this to you. Did you see that fatigue in your reporters and your readers, and how did you kind of adjust for that, if at all?
Well, we definitely did, in both. I think this summer especially, I think back to May and June was a time when on the reporter side, just extreme fatigue. And I think a lot of that had to do with there was so much else happening in the world on top of the pandemic at that time. I think you start to see all the classic symptoms of fatigue, of just feeling stressed out. I mean, we had to take a lot of, a lot more conversations of, how are you doing? Do you need a break? Actually encouraging people and sort of pushing people to actually take vacation, because, the funny thing is everybody was fatigued, but nobody wanted to take any time off. Partly because what were they going to do? Where were they going to go? But also because you almost, these journalists don't want to miss out on that big story too and what's going on. So we had to really balance that, especially this summer. That was a bit of an issue of saying, hey, you've got to take a break for it. You have to. And that always helped when people did. On the audience side, we saw that also. I think we watched the analytics on that pretty closely. And I do recall this fall, early in the fall, starting to see some of those COVID story numbers start to trail off a little bit. And I think us starting to shift gears a little bit. But then if you all remember what November was like in the state for COVID, October, November, things just spiked again. And those numbers went right back up for us in terms of interest, and really have sustained pretty steadily throughout that time. Certainly less so now, but I mean, we, like Amy said at the beginning, we definitely have overall seen readership increases as a result of all of this. It seems like many of those people who came to us for COVID coverage are sticking around for some of the other things that they maybe also got used to reading or watching when they were coming to our sites to read the COVID content.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, people have this intense need to gather as much information as quickly as possible. And for local news covering something like a pandemic, fact checking might be involved. And so we have this question that maybe I'll pose to Sydney first, and if anyone has any thoughts. How has the need for speed or immediacy caused by social media and increased pace of news, along with shortened consumer attention span, how has that all impacted fact checking and research and accuracy in the news? Because there's so much information coming from so many different areas. How do you make sure that everything that you're reporting is accurate yet fast at the same time?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's always like one of the biggest struggles when you're trying to do any kind of breaking news or anything that's very quick moving. The mantra I always just try to stick with is I'd rather be second than wrong. Like, being first is not, while you always want to be first, you don't want to be the first person wrong. So I think that's something that I think we try to do in our newsroom when we're talking about these kinds of things of, are you sure that you've got X, Y, Z, where'd you get this from? Just trying to do stuff very quickly, because we want to be able to get the news out to people quickly. They want it as soon as it's, available. So it's definitely tough, but the pain of being wrong I think sticks with a lot of journalists, that they'd rather be, they'd rather be right than first sometimes, I think.
Go ahead, Mary Jo, please. I was going to see if you had something to add.
That I think one of the bigger issues that I've seen, or one of the biggest struggles. I mean, yes, it is challenging in that time frame, because people want things now and they want them. But is that larger issue of, over the past year, somehow truth isn't, facts aren't as somehow as black and white as they used to be. Now I actually still think maybe they are, but with social media and the way that news is being disseminated and consumed right now, I think people are sometimes developing their own sets of truth on all sides of the equation. That's not a political statement. It's just that's happening. So I think for us, one of the more challenging things is maintaining that our footing as truth keepers, as truth tellers, when there are so many ways that people can consume news now that make that more challenging. It makes it more challenging to be able to just say, hey, this is fact, this is fiction. Those lines have gotten so blurry. You know, thanks to everything that's happened in the world this year, social media, I find that to be one of the biggest challenges right now related to what you brought up.
And Amy, how about you in your newsroom? How are you going about this balance?
Yeah, I agree with both Mary Jo and Sydney that that's been challenging, and you know, there's some readers who are going to challenge us because they don't believe in masks or because they think it's overhyped, and you know, we get some criticism just because people have strong opinions on all sides of these issues. Another thing that I would just mention as it relates to fact checking is that a lot of our sources have been incredibly busy during this time, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. And so sometimes it took us longer to get a question answered or get clarification from the health department just because everybody was so swamped trying to respond to the pandemic, and maybe getting back to the reporter isn't the top of their list. And so sometimes, you know, it took a while to get some of the facts right. And we would get questions from people like, what does the health department consider recovered? Or some people would get really into the numbers and they really want us to get clarification on all these things. And just because our sources were busy and working from home for the first time, sometimes that was challenging to get that answered.
And we have the questions are flowing in, by the way. We have some awesome questions coming in. Another one is, will any of the changes in the news gathering or storytelling that came about because of the pandemic remain in place going forward? And maybe Amy, I'll just leave that one in your court then. Will things that you've started to do during the pandemic stay in place?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, being able to file stories remotely is going to be a great help to us for any breaking news or any story. We're able to get the story or photo out to our readers faster. So those skills are definitely going to carry on. We do have a copy editor who works in Rhode Island. She happened to relocate during the pandemic and was going to put her notice in. And I said, well, you could still work for us from Rhode Island. And so sometimes if you've got a really key employee that you want to keep, maybe it works to have them work from another location. And so that's not going away. I think some of the best practices like covering like legislative committees we're able to cover remotely, whereas before we had to go. And sometimes that means we can kind of tune in, see if it's interesting discussion. If it's not, we can maybe refocus on something else, and it makes us more efficient. So some of the more efficient things that we've been able to do will definitely stay. I do think some of the reliance on phone interviews, hopefully we'll go back to doing more in-person interviews because there's a lot of value in that. You get to know the source a lot better. Sometimes they give you a tip, you know, when you have more casual moments with those sources. So I do hope we go back to some of the more traditional covering meetings in person when we can, but having the option to cover things more remotely does help us as well.
And I'll pose the same question to Mary Jo and Sydney, if either of you have thoughts on that. Will things stick around after the pandemic?
I think so. All of the things that Amy said, but then also I think there are some small things too. You know, one area, you know, for us that I think will stick around is is live content. So we got so used to, and people got used to things coming at them live during the pandemic, live press conferences, you know, just streams all over the place. And we have kept up with that, and I anticipate that's something that we will keep doing and will sort of, you know, also has the ability to change the landscape a little bit, you know, when we're doing so much bringing audience content live versus after the fact. But I think that will continue because it seems that the desire on the part of the audience is still there to consume it. And that's what we'll do at the end of the day, is kind of follow the reader's lead in terms of whether it be the news we choose to, or we cover after this, or, what things remain and what things go, we'll probably follow the lead of our readers.
Yeah, I would agree with Amy and Mary Jo too. Amy had mentioned, the ability to be able to cover committee hearings in legislature remotely. That's been great for our newsroom. I mean, we're up in Grand Forks, and I did go down to Bismarck at the end of January to go cover some higher education stuff. But the ability for us to be able to sit down and just watch it from our, living room while we're all still working from home has been fantastic. It's definitely a lot harder to get a hold of people and to be able to get those follow-up questions. And I definitely miss that as a reporter, and being able just to really dig into something. But I think that those kinds of meetings and stuff like that, I think that's going to be stuff that's going to hopefully stick around after the pandemic. Giving people more access to their government, I think is super important. And so just having like those committee meetings, for example, is just great to be able to pop whatever bill I'm working on and go in and see what's going on and see how close do I need to pay attention to this, everything like that. I think that's important for, not only journalists, but people generally.
And kind of that idea of access blends right into another question that we have, because a lot of access was opened up to, the legislature, but in terms of photojournalism, it probably got a little more difficult for some of the photojournalists out there to get access. And so we have a question asking, can you talk a bit about how photojournalism has changed during this time? Are you relying on submitted photos more? And are the photographers able to still capture moments with somewhat of the same access as before the pandemic hit? Or is there more of a halt on that? Yeah, in terms of photojournalism, Amy, what have you seen?
It's definitely been challenging, but I think it's just required more creativity. We still can shoot a meeting, but maybe it's the mayor with his Zoom call and, his attorney and everyone else is remote. So we've had to, just think about different ways to shoot the meeting. It's been challenging because we've all probably done a screenshot of a Zoom meeting, and that kind of maybe got a little old and we wanted to try to find other options. Sometimes, when the weather's been nice, it's been a little easier. If I remember for a Father's Day story we did last year, it wasn't COVID related, but he was an elderly gentleman at risk of COVID. We didn't want to go into his home. So our only option was really a photo of him on his porch. So we've definitely kept our photographers busy, and they've been producing some great images. It's just sometimes you have to think about it differently. We did have some really exciting opportunities, like getting into the Sanford COVID unit. That required us to plan ahead and have PPE and have the photographer being willing to be in that environment. Sometimes photographing at the vaccine or the testing sites has been challenging because sometimes people are concerned about privacy, but typically it's been pretty easy to find people that are willing to be photographed, and we've been able to show that.
And Mary Jo, how about with you? Have you seen any changes in the way photojournalism has kind of worked?
Yes, I think we probably have used a few more reader submitted photos than in the past. I would say that's probably a fair statement. But yes, ours too have had to get more creative. And, just the one thing I would say is the photojournalists who have been out there this last year in our communities and beyond are superstars in my mind, because honestly, even when sometimes a reporter might be able to stick back and do their interviews over the phone, in a lot of cases, our photographers were still out there, and even at the height of it, had to be out there doing their job and taking extra precautions and kind of putting themselves, in harm's way a lot this last year. So they kept at it and kept doing everything they could. And yes, we have more photos from the last year of people with masks on. That's kind of going to be strange to look back on someday. But I mean, they did a phenomenal job this last year.
And Sydney, maybe I'll pose a different question for you. It sounds like your newsrooms overcame a lot of challenges with photojournalism and access and everything. But on the flip side, with news consumers, what challenges did you see for your news consumers through this, either during the pandemic or maybe challenges you see in the future for those consumers?
Yeah, I think that, it's probably a mix of them trying to, Mary Jo had mentioned earlier that there's the difference in truth, even though obviously we we believe in the truth and everything like that. I think that it'll probably be, we've had to downsize the amount of print editions, for example, that we've been doing. As my cat tries to knock something over. Sorry, everybody. Uh, so, that's a different access point for a lot of people. There's a lot of people that were relying on those print editions to be able to consume news. And so now we have to find new ways to teach those folks how to, for example, access our e-editions or get them comfortable with the websites. So that's a challenge for that population. I think definitely it's typically older folks. But I mean, I hear the couple of times that I've been in the office and I've heard, somebody talking somebody through how to, access their e-edition. I think that they're slowly starting to adapt, and, it'll be interesting just to see how that goes going forward.
And Mary Jo, I'm going to give the same question to you. Have you noticed any challenges for your news readers, or see that challenges may be coming up for them?
Yeah, I think that just a general statement there is that there's a lot of noise out there right now, and there's a lot of news sources, not so newsy sources. There's just a lot of information out there at every turn. And I think that the challenge for them, it's a challenge for us too, is, kind of reducing some of that noise and getting focused in on, the truth, getting focused in on what matters to our communities and those community issues. And some of those don't have anything to do with COVID or politics or anything else. And we've maybe lost a little bit of track of some of those things. So I think that's going to be a challenge, and related to that, because I see somebody asked this question about from a news consumer standpoint, our reach because of the reduction of print days, as Sydney just mentioned as well. We have reduced print days, in our publications, and I wouldn't say that has impacted our reach so much, just because from the digital standpoint, we're still we're probably producing more content than ever, and we don't have limitations of the cost of printing and delivery of newspapers. So we're probably reaching more communities in a further stretch than we ever have before. But for consumers, it's been challenging because we've been asking them to change the way in which they read the news or consume the news, and that's a big shift. And that's not lost on us, that's a shift, and it's not going to happen overnight, and not everybody's going to be happy about that overnight. Just sort of a reality of the world we're living in now. But certainly that's a big thing for news consumers, is just generally speaking, changing the ways in which they find access and consume news.
And Amy, have you been experiencing kind of the same thing as Mary Jo and Sydney then, in terms of how folks are consuming the news during the pandemic, and any changes with that?
Yeah, so during the pandemic, we did reduce from 7 print days to 6, and it wasn't really related to the pandemic. It was something that we were moving toward because of our readers are going more digital, and so we're responding to that. So one of the challenges is that some people thought that was temporary because it happened during the pandemic, and some of our more traditional readers really miss print, and we understand that. So it's been kind of more of an education process. A lot of our new readers are coming to us digital only, but some of the more traditional prints, we've have to kind of educate them on where to find the story. I a lot of times get calls on Monday morning, why didn't you guys cover the Bison game? And I say, well, we did. And I have to tell them, you know, it's online here, or you can find it on our digital edition. It's kind of an education process. But I think for the most part, readers are really embracing it. There's a lot of benefits of being able to get your newspaper not being tied to a print product, whether they're snowbirds or whether they just like the flexibility of being able to take it with them. So I think people are embracing it. It's just some education to some of our more traditional readers.
And that makes me kind of curious too, in hearing about, you know, your typical news consumers. Through the pandemic, you were having a lot thrown at you from different angles, you know, covering a global pandemic, but then also having some resources just not available, like travel and things like that. So what was your feedback from your communities and your readership about the job that you were doing? And I know that might touch a nerve in some way, but did you notice that the community was mostly respectful of what you were doing, or did you have any, you know, rough times with that? And Mary Jo, maybe you want to start.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You know, we certainly had a few rough times with that. You know, we'll state the last part of what you asked again.
Yeah, I just want to know what the general feedback from your communities and your readers were.
Yeah, so I think so. It depends on when I think back in the last year or so. It's almost like in chunks where like in the beginning, really, really positive and really good. I think that the feedback and the support was really there. I think there were rough spots this summer and fall, then it kind of rebounded again. I mean, it's just kind of follows like the world and how everybody is feeling, you know. I think by and large, the community has been good and supportive, but challenged by it all the same, if that makes sense. It's not necessarily a simple thing to answer. I think it depends on your perspective and, you know, where you're looking at it from. It's kind of a vague answer.
It was a vague question, so that's completely fine. And Amy and Sydney, since you kind of serve different communities, did you experience anything different or pretty similar to what Mary Jo said?
You know, it's interesting because I get a lot more feedback as editor than I did as reporter. And so I think we got a lot of really supportive feedback about our coverage of the pandemic. The area where I got probably the most criticism was the Associated Press coverage of the national election. You know, we had a lot of readers that just really took issue with the way the AP covered national politics. And, you know, that it was kind of tough for me to take some of those calls sometimes. That's our source for national news. And so, you know, some people were critical of those stories. And that was probably the area where I got the most negative feedback in the last year. As far as feedback on our change in print schedule, we really didn't get, I think because the Forum had already made some changes in their print schedule and ours was, we still have 6 days print. We didn't really have as much reaction as maybe we thought we would have because we still have quite a few days of print and people were understanding of that. So.
Yeah, I would say that we were pretty similar to what Amy and Mary Jo said too. You know, I think for a lot of this, I've been a reporter and community editor at the Herald through all this. So actually, a lot of the feedback that I was getting personally was mostly positive, with an occasional, you know, person that's going to call you up and yell at you about they don't want to read anymore about coronavirus and other, you know, nice choice words mixed into there. But that wasn't really that surprising, I guess. I think that at a certain point, you know, earlier we were talking about COVID fatigue and whether or not, you know, we saw that with like readers and with ourselves and stuff. And I think as people became more and more COVID fatigued, the people started to harp a little bit more on that coverage. And And then, you know, in November, people were back to being kind of like nice about everything and very supportive. And recently it's kind of been a little bit more of the like, why are you still covering this? Yada, yada, yada kind of stuff. But I mean, it's not really that surprising, I guess, to me. You know.
And it's interesting that I think a couple of you brought up the fact that, you know, during the pandemic, there was also something else huge going on. It was the 2020 election. And so newsrooms had a lot to balance too, between how do we cover both of these enormous things in a balanced way while still looking at what's most important at the time. Did any of your newsrooms struggle with that balance of how much time we spend on one or the other, or did that kind of just naturally happen? And Sydney, maybe I'll start with you on that one. For the Herald, how did you kind of balance coverage of these two monumental things happening in 2020?
Yeah, I think that it was tough at times. I mean, I think about the number of staff that we have, and I think we have, you know, 6 or 7 reporters on staff at the Herald. And, you know, so much of our coverage for the past year was just dedicated every day to something related to coronavirus. And I mean, it still is kind of that way. But so then when you mix the election in there, you're asking, you know, your city or county people that, you know, have elections that they need to be paying attention to also have to worry about making sure that they cover the mayor's meeting, you know, about coronavirus, you know, whatever topic is going on there. So it became hard to just try and make sure that everybody wasn't also like too overwhelmed with what they were doing. And but yeah, I think it did become a bit harder. We had to be very careful about like and exact about what we were doing, you know, at the end of October, beginning of November, when the election rolled around, and just making sure that we were really on top of everything, because you don't want to, you know, solely focus on, you know, election and lose a bunch of coronavirus coverage, especially at that time when cases were starting to go back up in the state. You know, you don't want to lose one or the other. So it was tough, but I think we made do, and I think we did really great work at the Herald, at least.
And Mary Jo, would you say you experienced some of the same with your staff?
Yeah, you know, as Amy had mentioned, we all rely on other sources. In our case, it's Reuters. We previously used Washington Post and New York Times for national wire services, and we actually stopped using them. I want to say it was this fall at the end of the year. We had gotten so much negative feedback on those as news sources and just not being, so when I'm talking about the election, I mean, so that what was coming in was just not, was not working for us, was not working for readers anymore. So we eliminated those news services and shifted to Reuters, which is, you know, probably people still being critical of it, but much more balanced all in all. So, you know, in a way we're lucky we have that content coming to us from another source. So it's not like we are doing so much direct coverage of the election outside of our local ones, of course, but so we rely on others to do that. But we have of course had to cover all of the after effects of it and the trickle down effect of, you know, what was happening at the national level and how that was impacting local communities. And of course, you know, as was so unique this last year, the way in which politics and medicine and health sort of just all bled together, and just covering that just in general together as one issue, when, you know, in reality, it's like, oh, how is this all the same issue? I think that's been hard, just figuring out where one begins and ends and where it should begin and end, and sifting through that.
And Amy, I know you're sitting in the heart of government in Bismarck, so this probably was heightened for you. What did you experience?
Yeah, it was really challenging when we were going through the list of all the elections that we had to cover, and we cover Burleigh and Morton County, so that, you know, we've got, you know, 2 communities that we're covering as well as the state races. We look as much as we can at how much we can partner, and we find out what is Associated Press covering that we can use so we don't duplicate that. we partner with Prairie Public. And so some of Dave Thompson's election coverage, we were able to use some of that to just try to make our resources go farther. But it was really challenging, especially with like when you get down to some of the legislative races. We really had to prioritize, okay, this one's an open seat, let's put our resources here. Some of these others where it's longtime incumbents running, we probably didn't write about those races very much because we just had to prioritize. And if we didn't have the pandemic, maybe we would have been able to spend even more time on each individual election. Another thing that was challenging is a lot of times we would cover like open forum for some of these candidates. And for the most part, there were no open forums this fall. And that was one really good opportunity, not only for the voters, but it was a good opportunity for us as reporters because you could have access to all three at once. And we didn't have that opportunity this year. They kind of shifted to doing more, at least locally, they did kind of public access interviews with people on TV. And it wasn't quite the same sort of open forum thing that we could cover. So that was challenging. I think we did it well though. One thing that we missed, and I remember taking a call right after election, is Veterans Day. And we didn't have a very good Veterans Day story. Like we had a story, but just with the pandemic and with the election, there was just not enough time to really plan. Like normally we'd probably have an A1 nice feature on a veteran. And we just didn't have the ability to get to everything. So it definitely was challenging, but we just had to prioritize.
And your newsrooms faced obviously tons of challenges throughout this pandemic, but you always, it's cliche to say, but there's always that silver lining. And so what have you noticed as victories in local journalism during this time? Because as much as the tough times piled up, there had to have been some moments in all of your newsrooms that felt like victories for you, or even shared amongst just local journalism in general. Mary Jo, maybe I'll start with you. Did you see any victories for either your news team or just victories in local journalism as a whole?
Well, yes, certainly. I think I remember a few times feeling really good about things. Let's see, right? We're always focused on the solving the problems. No, this is actually kind of more of almost like a workforce thing. It's been interesting in the journalism world because and maybe a lot of professions are like this, but I think there used to be a real focus on measuring success by the amount of time you spent in your chair and how long you worked every day. I don't know why. I think that existed definitely in journalism. It's like the longer you sit there at night, the more committed you are to the job. And when we got into this environment where that was no longer a factor, everybody just really started to focus on the work, the actual journalism, the stories, and doing those. And this sort of that other stuff went away a little bit. And I sort of appreciate that just from a general workforce standpoint, where I feel like our priorities got better aligned as a result of that shift that was required. The one time that I remember, feeling especially like just grateful to work here and grateful to be part of this was actually this summer. I believe it was, I don't recall if it was May or June, but when we had rioting in the streets, and it was I believe it was a Saturday night. I mean, everybody remembers that stretch, that week. And, I don't think most of our journalists had been in our room for a long time. And I feel like it was a Saturday, and just people started showing up. They showed up with their masks on, ready to do whatever was necessary to cover the story, to be everywhere so that our readers had access to everything. And those are those moments you realize it's like, gosh, these, really committed group of people who do this, and how lucky we are to be a part of that and to have the opportunity to do that.
And Sydney, maybe I'll ask you the same question then. Any victories in your newsroom that really settled in deep with you, or just journalism?
Yeah, I think that this entire thing, as horrible as everything has been, it's given us the chance to really like prioritize the things that kind of matter and this kind of stories that we want to pursue, you know, because we don't want people, I think it's so easy now, at least for I think about myself, of oh, I'll just pop on real quick if it's like 8 o'clock, whatever, and write something up. And I think it's so easy for a lot of people just to be able to sit down and do that and not really, you know, necessarily like take the time earlier. Like Mary Jo had mentioned, you know, begging people to take time off or asking people to take time off. So I think that this has given us a chance to just be able to think about um, you know, what is the kind of stories that we want to be doing, and then what's the kind of time that we want to put into them. You know, earlier I had talked about the northern border project that we had worked on, and that's a big point of pride for us that we were able to get all of that done remotely. And it was more than just the people that, you know, had went up to the border to go, you know, film the interviews and talk to people and write the stories and edit the stories. You know, also during that time, like if two of our reporters were going up to Lancaster to go work on something, you know, that meant that two of us weren't around to be able to sit down and write every day necessarily. So our, you know, other reporters would maybe have to pick up an extra story. And so I think that it was a good project for us to be able to learn and to really work together as a team. It's something I'm very proud of for our newsroom.
And Amy, I have to hear about your positive times as well. What did you see through this that really sparked some joy in you? Sorry if that sounded very Netflix show.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we really pride ourselves on the watchdog role that we play as journalists. And so being able to be at over 200 press conferences, or I kind of lost track of how many press conferences where we were, and we're able to ask important questions each time. And one danger that I saw in the pandemic as these government agencies switched to more remote meetings was, you know, there was a danger of not having public access, or them maybe getting kind of lax on public access to some of their meetings. In the early days, there was the vaccine committee was not following the public meeting notices. They were not properly noticing their meeting. I don't think it was anything intentional by anybody. I think it was just one of those things that they were so busy and just kind of forgot that they needed to do this step. And it was because of the NDNA attorney and also the Bismarck Tribune really poking them and keep asking about these meetings that led to them finally noticing the meeting and making it public. And so that was something that I was really proud of, because it not only meant we could attend the meeting, but it meant anybody from the public could attend the meeting. And they were making really important decisions about how the vaccine was going to be distributed in our state.
And I do have to ask too, you know, what challenges do you think moving forward now, with all the changes in the industry now? There were challenges before the pandemic hit for the industry, but then the pandemic hit and that changed a lot of things too. Now we're not out of the pandemic yet, but moving forward, what kind of challenges do you see in your industry that you are hopefully going to proactively tackle or try to come at in new innovative ways? What kind of challenges do you see? And maybe Mary Jo, I'll start with you on this one.
One of the big ones that we're talking about, and now I am recognizing I'm starting to sound like a broken record on this, but is news literacy and public trust issues. Just that's been a big theme of the last year for us, and just something that has, you know, we've really been thinking about a lot and taking seriously, is just what role do we have in going forward in helping the public better understand the role of journalists, better appreciate the role of journalists, and why this is important and what that means, and how as citizens they can interact and that they can have a part in that as well. And so news literacy, public trust is going to be one of those major areas for us going forward. That will be a focus area that maybe wouldn't have been on our radar as much had it not been for this last year.
And Amy, I'm going to bounce back over to you with the same question. What kind of challenges do you see moving forward?
Yeah, I agree with what Mary Jo said. I think the biggest challenge for me is just that our resources are really stretched. And the best way to address that is to get more support from our community and really emphasize to them the importance of subscribing to the paper and supporting local journalism. And so you'll see it's been kind of a shift where, you know, I'm not really from a marketing standpoint, but I'm now putting Facebook messages about how you can support local journalism, and this is the editor's special for the month. And you know, that's a new kind of thing for me to do, but I think it's really important because there's a direct tie to that support for our subscriptions and the amount of resources that we're able to invest in covering our communities.
And Sydney, now you have a new role at the Herald where this is going to be probably more on your shoulders than ever before. What kind of challenges do you see moving forward for the Herald and journalism?
Yeah, and Mary Jo really stole what I wanted to talk about, but that's okay. I think that I think that one thing that's also going to be challenging is, you know, trying to get those readers that we brought in during the pandemic and people that have been sticking around and subscribing to the Herald and to all the foreign communication properties and papers generally across the state and country. How do you keep those people? You know, what kind of content are they interested in? You know, did they come for the health or, you know, coronavirus coverage? But what are they sticking around for? And we want to make sure that we're giving them content that's interesting for them and things that they want to see and interact with. So I think that those are going to be big conversations that we're going to be definitely having at the Herald of, you know, how can we make sure that we keep all of these subscribers that we've been able to gain this past year?
I just want to say one other thing on that front. We talked about COVID fatigue, but I think one of my biggest fears is that we're going to hit this point where there's just news fatigue, where people just simply say, I can't take any more. I can't take any more of this. My sanity can't take any more of this. And they start turning it all off essentially, without, you know, discernment for, you know, one news source versus the other, and they just simply tune out. That's my fear, and I think a big thing that we have to overcome, because obviously any of us who are in this business believe in it and believe it's important. And I understand people feeling that way and wanting to just take a break from it all. But in the long run, you know, there's danger in that as well. If everybody goes that direction, you know, for our profession, but also for our communities. So I think that's something we're gonna have to really be on the watch out for.
Well, unfortunately, we are all out of time. This has flown by. This has been absolutely fascinating. And I really appreciate the three of you joining us for this discussion, because for the folks who are outside of the media business, we get one side of everything. But it was terrific to hear all of your insights. So thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And Sadie,
Thank you.
I'll hand it right back over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And we thank you for your hard work. And thank you for reporting and getting the information out to us that we need. We really, really appreciate it.